The World Trade Organization is an organization set up around a set of rules that limits the choices of governments related to international trade. These rules define what is legal and illegal when it comes to a wide range of state policies that might affect international trade. As an overview, the WTO has 164 members and observers, including some that are not states. The main areas of competence are around policies that members choose that have an impact on international trade. The WTO tries to create a stable regulatory environment for international trade and also aims for rule-governed trade rather than what we know as free trade. And it also exists to settle disputes between members about violations of the rules, and also authorizes retaliatory tariffs under the dispute settlement understanding. So the WTO establishes rules about international trade, essentially removing a lot of choices from states. And the rules are usually around import tariffs, industrial subsidies, and all manner of taxes and regulations. For WTO member countries, any government policy that might have an impact on private firms that trade across its borders could conceivably come under the scrutiny of the organization. But all goods and services are not covered, and not all trade influencing policies are prohibited. So interpreting the WTO rules has become an industry in and of itself, both inside the organization and its dispute body, and also outside of the organization in the international universe of trade lawyers, lobbyists, and activists. So the WTO is a key institution among those that govern the international political economy. As such, it is central to a lot of controversies associated with globalization. Its main component is the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, a treaty from 1947 that specifies how countries can regulate their imports and exports. The WTO also oversees an agreement on the trade in services, known as GATS rules, as well as rules on intellectual property, TRIPS, and trade dispute resolution processes, as well as rules on agricultural trade and subsidies, among many other elements. The WTO itself is a small formal organization and bureaucracy with a staff of just 640 folks, but it has a reach that is both broad and deep. It has been joined by 164 member governments, and the substantive scope of the trade agreements that it manages is comprehensively global. As a consequence, virtually all world trade takes place under WTO rules. So as the dominant legal regime in world trade, the WTO makes three main contributions to the international economic system. First, it establishes rules that govern how members can set domestic policies affecting international trade. Second, it requires that members maintain public lists of import tariffs for all products. And it sets up court-like dispute settlement processes to hear complaints when one member believes another is breaking these rules. Governments that are WTO members are much less autonomous in their policymaking than non-WTO members, but they expect to be wealthier by virtue of participating in a world where international trade is made easier and cheaper for firms. The WTO system includes different rules for different kinds of products. Rules for agricultural bulk goods are different than for manufactured products, and different again from traded services such as accounting, banking, and professional services. In agriculture, for instance, direct subsidies from governments to producers are permitted, and for textiles and apparel, import quotas were common in the 2000s. But quotas and subsidies are generally prohibited for manufactured goods. Government procurement has its own rules, permitting discrimination in favor of domestic suppliers in ways that would be illegal if applied elsewhere in the economy. Many other categories, special rules, and side deals exist and ensure that one must pay close attention to details in order to know which rules apply to which products. Understanding this patchwork of rules is explained by looking at the desires of powerful governments. All negotiators try to shape the rules around their own interests, but the strongest governments in the WTO clearly dominate the results. The leading power players include the US, the European Union, and Japan, with China and Brazil exerting new influence, and Australia and Canada having notable influence in agricultural and some natural resources. The fact that, for instance, agricultural subsidies are permitted while industrial subsidies are not comes directly from the strongest states' desire to continue to underwrite their farm industries while simultaneously wanting market competition in manufactured goods. The shrimp turtle case that the WTO heard and involving the United States and some of its trading partners exemplifies two of the important problems for the future of international trade and law. The first is how the WTO will respond to the environmental consequences related to trade, and relatedly, will they be able to make some kind of alteration to be able to target how things are made along with how they are traded. So the WTO creates obligations and restrictions on all of its members related to their domestic economic policies. These are shared obligations on all members, and together they create the framework within most international trade in goods takes place. These are subject to various exceptions and provisos depending on trading partners and the rules. And as you can imagine, the dispute resolution process entails a lot of arguing over what the meaning of words in the GATT are from 1947. When a government joins the WTO, they are required to agree to a ceiling for the import tax it charges on each imported good. This maximum tariff can be different for each item, but the country must publish a list called a schedule of all of its tariff rates, also called concessions, and must agree to not unilaterally raise those rates above the published levels. These become the bound tariffs of the country, and the schedule automatically becomes part of the WTO treaty. Article 2 1A of the GATT says each contracting party shall accord to the commerce of the other contracting parties treatment no less favorable than that provided for in the appropriate part of the appropriate schedule annexed to this agreement. As these commitments are made by all members, the result is a comprehensive set of maximum tariffs on almost all international trade, organized into thousands of categories and subcategories. Almost all categories of traded goods are now covered by bound tariffs, 99% of developed country imports and 73% of developing country imports, according to the WTO. The binding rates cannot be changed except through the multilateral process of negotiations among members that take place at the big review conferences of the WTO itself. Firms that seek to import or export goods therefore know with great certainty that the taxes will be charged on their commerce as it crosses borders, and tariff rates generally remain stable for the years between negotiating rounds. In the United States, the list of tariffs is published by the U.S. International Trade Commission and is known as the Harmonized Tariff Schedule, the HTS. This link here should take you to box 5.1 in your textbook to show you what the harmonized schedule looks like. There are three categories of imports recognized: those that come from WTO originating countries, those that come from special trade agreement countries, and then everyone else. And the rates of tariffs are decided between the United States and its trading partners within the WTO boundaries, and the definition of these categories influences trade and production around the world. The second key rule in the WTO is the idea of most favored nation. This is defined in Article 1 of the GATT Treaty, which says, in part, any advantage, favor, privilege, or immunity granted by any contracting party to any product originating in or destined for any other country shall be accorded immediately and unconditionally to the like product of all other contracting parties. This rule requires that members maintain a single set of trade tariffs and rules for their trade with all other WTO members. Members may not treat WTO members differently and may not negotiate bilaterally with other states for special treatment except in free trade areas. The principle of most favored nation is central to the entire mission of the WTO. Along with the rule of national treatment, it creates a uniform web of trade rules across the WTO trading zone and helps drive down both the rates of tariff applied by countries and the transaction cost of trading firms. Article 1 of the GATT also covers any advantage, favor, privilege, and not just tariff rates. So this means that any policy with implications for international trade may end up under scrutiny for treating different sources of imports differently. For instance, a country that requires safety inspections for imported machinery must ensure that these inspections are equally mandatory, equally available, and equally strict for all trading partners. The equality must be maintained in practice, and so governments must constantly be alert to how they are implementing their rules. Any hint that a policy produces an informal barrier to trade might generate a formal WTO complaint by the harmed members. The shrimp turtle case was lost by the U.S. because American policy was deemed to treat some shrimp exporting countries more favorably than others, which is a violation of most favored nations and Article 1. The special column of the HTS presents entries that reflect better than most favored nation import tariffs on a product. And this is the case in the U.S. for agreements with the North American Free Trade Agreement, the U.S.-Jordan Free Trade Area, and the U.S.-Israeli Free Trade Area, among many others. So the special column basically establishes better than favored nation status. And this is allowed because it falls under the special rules in the WTO for free trade areas. And to give you an idea of the number and scope of free trade areas in the world, this is a map of the most influential, largest free trade blocs. The principle of national treatment goes along with most favored nations. Where most favored nations requires that countries not discriminate among their trading partners, national treatment requires that they not discriminate between imported goods and domestically produced goods. This principle applies to like products on the market, as does most favored nations principles. Members are forbidden to apply rules, taxes, or any other costly burden to imported goods that are not equally applied to domestic goods. And this could apply to non-tax as well as tariffs and other types of policies like safety, environmental regulations on labeling. Goods have to be treated equally regardless of where they come from. And all this is based on market-based logic that the best products will eventually emerge in a competitive scenario. And so national treatment is expressly anti-protectionist, and that is a policy, domestic policy, that protects literally infant industries as well as existing industries. National treatment is expressly designed to prevent countries from favoring their domestic producers over international competitors. For instance, the U.S. complained in 2004 that China was taxing imported integrated circuits more onerously than the same goods produced by domestic Chinese factories. Similarly, the EU has maintained for several years that India and its states charge higher domestic rates on imported wines and spirits than on domestic production. The U.S. and Canada have fought a series of cases in which the U.S. complained that Canadian provinces were discriminating against U.S. beer imports with a host of indirect non-tariff barriers, such as imposing environmental charges on beer cans at a time when U.S. beer was disproportionately in cans rather than in bottles. The Government Procurement Agreement, an optional protocol to the WTO, requires that government spending be done on non-discriminatory grounds, subject to some exceptions. The agreement has been signed by most of the largest governments, including the U.S., the EU, and Japan, though not by China. In the U.S., it means that government-sponsored Buy American programs are legally suspect. This is often seen by economic nationalists as an unwelcome limit on state sovereignty, and as such, it is often used as a critique against the WTO's rules. Conventional macroeconomic models of international trade suggest that trade produces gains for both trading partners. It is said to increase efficiency by allowing countries to specialize in the products that they make relatively more efficiently and by encouraging production on a larger scale. It is also said to increase the choice available to consumers by making available products that otherwise would not be produced in the home market. In spite of these benefits, countries sometimes have strong countervailing reasons why they find it advantageous to try to circumvent their commitments to freer trade. The WTO's record in encouraging compliance with its rules is therefore mixed. There are two main incentives of governments for violating the trade policy rules of the WTO: to protect a politically important sector or company, and to unilaterally increase trade barriers or export subsidies while your partners refrain from retaliating. The first is a function of the uneven distribution of cost and benefits from trade, while the second is closer to outright cheating. The distributional problem arises because while there may be overall gains from trade for both partners, the aggregate outcome obscures the fact that the costs and benefits of trade are unevenly distributed across domestic industries and between trading partners. States often find that the patterns of trade that result from following WTO rules are not the same as the patterns they favor for other reasons. For instance, the U.S. discovered in the 1980s that imported cars were winning the market share in the U.S. away from the big three American car makers. This change in the composition of the U.S. car market, followed in part from freer trade in autos, created a threat to industrial employment in the U.S. that was highly geographically concentrated in Michigan. It therefore created a political threat to office holders from Michigan and led to a series of legal moves in D.C. to protect American car makers from imports. Most significantly, the U.S. forced Japan to accept voluntary export restraints on its auto industry, which caused the retail price of cars in the U.S. to rise 41% from 1981 to 1984, far faster than other prices were increasing. A similar pattern was at work in the decision in 1947 to treat agricultural exports differently than most others. Agricultural goods are exempt from the rules of the GATT described above because few powerful countries are willing to bear the political impact of allowing free trade in agriculture. This is one area in which powerful governments in world trade prefer supply management to market-based outcomes. Economists often call these political trade-offs irrational because they mean countries are effectively choosing a policy that makes them poorer than they would otherwise be. But from the perspective of politicians, there is nothing irrational about being sensitive to the cost of trade as well as benefits. Governments have been overthrown by elections and by force as a result of social upheaval that quickly resulted from changing trade. To protect an industry, whether it be agriculture or steel or shipbuilding from collapse as a means of cheaper, better imports, for just cheaper, better imports, may not be a smart public policy. The WTO agreement also includes a series of exemptions to allow governments to respond to political pressures of their citizens. There are exemptions for national security concerns, for relief against unexpected surges in imports, for some cultural products like films, and for a range of public policy goals, including health and safety standards, public morals, and protecting endangered species. The extent of each exemption is defined by the legal language of its article, and a close reading is necessary. And so there are some short-term gains that countries might also gain by cheating, by displacing costs onto freer countries that have freer trade with non-tariff barriers so that their published rates do not reflect the true barriers. A couple of examples here related to hormone-injected beef and different types of film in the movie industry. So there are just some interesting cases listed in this chapter. So there is a complicated position of the WTO at the boundary between government policies and private firms' behavior. The trade regulated by the WTO is conducted by private firms, but the WTO can only create obligations on governments. So that's one interesting dynamic. The dynamic of members' compliance and non-compliance with the WTO is also an interesting dynamic. The hope is that long-term compliance and trade will pay off in a way that is higher than cheating. So the hope is that compliance will come about through self-interested practice. When states find that the benefits of compliance are not enough to outweigh the incentives for cheating, we expect them to begin cheating. And at that point, the WTO system shifts into enforcement mode. So that entails mobilizing the self-interest of the other members in defense of the rules. And so this means that the enforcement function is decentralized, relying on each member to retaliate according to the WTO rules against the violating member. So the WTO's power over enforcement is limited to identifying what counts as a violation and authorizing punishment. So there is a formal dispute settlement process, but the initiative for complaint must come from a member who has suffered economic harm due to the misbehavior of another. So complaints are only brought to the WTO after failed consultations between affected parties and failure of these retaliatory moves of other members. So the WTO does not monitor compliance. It only responds when a complaint has been made. And once a member formally submits a dispute, a panel of 3 trade experts is created and asked to hear arguments from the parties and report recommendations on the legal questions. The offended party may appeal to the appellate body and general membership of the WTO, and the Committee of the Whole approves or rejects the report. The findings in the WTO are legally binding, and there actually is a pretty good record of resolving these disputes. Around 2/3 of them resolve before needing a panel. Refusal to comply with the panel report could result in sanctions that are authorized by the Dispute Settlement Board after the state has been given the opportunity to change its policy. The Dispute Settlement Board judges the size of harm and permits equal compensation in the same area of trade if possible. That's not always the practice. But also retaliatory tariffs may be most equitably used by equal trading partners, meaning they're the most useful between equal trading partners. So retaliatory measures authorized by the WTO are almost always economic in nature, related to trade. So just some brief notes about the structure of the WTO. A lot of its most impactful decisions get made at the ministerial conference meetings that take place every 2 years. One of these was very influential in 1999 in Seattle. This is what your videos are about this week, the battle for Seattle. The ministerial conference meetings meet to reflect on decisions that relate to any multilateral trade agreements. The body is consensus-based, and so as such, it has a higher threshold to pass decisions. So there's a 2/3 and 3/4 supermajority required to interpret existing trade agreements, to waive obligations assumed under trade agreements, or to amend existing multilateral trade agreements, as well as admitting new members. The day-to-day operations are overseen by the General Counsel, and the dispute settlement body, the DSB, and the trade review body are underneath the General Counsel. There are also various councils that oversee broad areas of trade around certain categories of trade. And as well, there are specific aspects within the WTO that deal with access or technical barriers. Multinational corporations have a big presence in the WTO structure. The WTO structure, even though it mostly deals with governments, also hears from firms. So the WTO structure has been useful to them for helping establish the structure of horizontal investments and switching them to vertical investments, and also to help establish a multilateral investment agreement. For more information, see the first bullet point PDF link. So the United States policies have been the subject of complaint at the WTO in many instances, but 2 very famous cases exemplify some of the complications with the WTO. The first is the U.S. Clean Air Act. Brazil and Venezuela argued that EPA regulations harmed their petroleum exports. In 1996, the shrimp turtle policy was contested by India, Malaysia, Pakistan, and Thailand, claiming that the United States was treating less developed economies differently when it came to their shrimp exports. And the reason turtle is even a part of that label is because turtle safe shrimping practices were becoming to be a preferred policy in the United States. And the lesser developed economies did not have the technology to basically shrimp in that manner. So essentially, the WTO found that the United States was discriminating against these countries. And this introduced some of the issues with interpreting what like products really are. Does it pertain to just the substance of the product, or does it have anything to do with the way that it was manufactured? So a similar issue is dolphin safe tuna. So how to fish for tuna without harming dolphin, which often occupy the same waters. And is that a genuine and allowable type of restriction on product? So there are more other types of issues. For example, genetically modified products. The European Union has very strict protocol about labeling those, for example. And so it is important really to kind of look at some of these cases that illustrates the limitations of countries to develop their own domestic policy when we think about international organizations and whether they're able to subvert sovereignty. And from various points of view, except for perhaps the liberal standpoint, you can identify places where the WTO makes it more difficult for countries to be sovereign states. And from a developing country standpoint, this could be even more detrimental. If you're thinking about a country that is trying to build its economy in different ways, that it might be restricted by the WTO from protecting its own industries and allowing them to become efficient. And so this is really just to point out that there are quite a bit of varied ideological criticisms of the WTO.